Hey everyone. So, two quick things. First, my Facebook group page for the Suzanne Venker Show is back up. I'd been using that page for something else, but I have since moved it back to a private page just for listeners of the Suzanne Venker Show. I want a place where you all can talk with each other and where I can chime in periodically with questions and comments myself. So be aware that if you're itching to talk about the things you're hearing on this program, there is now a place to do that. Just go to facebook.com/groups/Suzanne's group. And if for some reason that doesn't work, just try going to Facebook and typing in the Suzanne Venker Show, and hopefully it will come right up. And then click on join. Okay, secondly, when was the last time you took a hot second to write a review of this podcast? I get super sad when I check it periodically and no one's written anything in like a week. I just wanted to tell you how much those reviews mean to me and to the algorithms too. Pretty sure the more reviews there are, the more the show will appear in other people's feeds and whatnot. So if you think you'll forget, like I know I probably would, keep in mind you can pause this program right now and do it, and you won't miss a thing when you come back. We'll still be here in the same spot. That's my favorite thing about podcasts. They're like DVR, which is so awesome. Okay, on with the show. From the magnificent Midwest, it's the Suzanne Venker Show, where men and women are equal in value but wildly different by nature. Join us here every week as we challenge the culture's hugely flawed narratives about men, women, sex, and love. From coast to coast and from around the world, thank you for joining us. So today we're going to talk about 6 powerful ways to divorce-proof your marriage. This first one may seem kind of, I don't know, simple, but I put it as number 1 because I think it's sort of the base for everything else. And that is to take divorce off the table. Just pretend it isn't an option. And there's a reason for this that's very logical and psychological in scope. Knowing that you can always get out of something will directly affect the amount of effort you put into it. And the research has shown this. Barry Schwartz wrote a great book called The Paradox of Choice, which I highly recommend. And in that book, he said, quote, "When a decision is final, we engage in a variety of psychological processes that enhance our feelings about the choice we made relative to the alternatives." And then another great book by Daniel Gilbert called Stumbling Upon Happiness goes even further. He writes, quote, "The psychological immune system works best when we are totally stuck, when we are trapped." And this makes perfect sense when you think about it. Because the fewer choices you have, the more weight those choices are going to have on your life. Imagine, for example, being trapped on an island with one person. Like, that's it. This is it. Someone says, here you are with this other person for life, even if it's not even a spouse, just whatever, just a person. You and he or she are going to have to make that work, or you're dead, right? Or you're screwed, or whatever the case may be. And so the inability to leave can actually create opportunity that you wouldn't otherwise see or create or think of because you think you have an out or an alternative. So it's a very subtle sort of psychological thing that goes on if you carry that mentality with you. Because there's going to be times when your marriage is going to suck. It might even be years. In a long marriage, you could have several years, even at different points of time, where it's actually bad. But we have research that has shown that couples who were unhappy at one time but didn't get divorced were actually happy 5 years later. Which, again, it's because you're playing the long game and recognizing that 1 year of doom or feeling like doom doesn't mean forever, that it's fixable, and it's not fixable if you're not together. There's also studies that show that many people regret getting divorced because divorce actually creates more problems than it solves. All of which is to say, you'd be amazed at how many problems can actually be solved by simply not leaving. I think I read that somewhere where someone's like, "What's the secret to a long marriage?" And she said, "Don't get divorced." Now, this is all assuming, of course, that you're not in danger of any kind. I feel like I have to say that. I hate that I have to say that, actually, because I feel like it goes without saying, but I do. So let me make that very clear. Obviously, if you are in harm's way, this would not apply. This is just for the average, otherwise healthy relationship. Okay, number 2. This is probably the biggest, certainly the biggest of what I'm seeing on my end when it comes to modern marriages and relationships. Lower your expectations. Lower them. For a while I really hesitated using that word because I've been writing about this for some years. And I used to say, like, make your expectations realistic, or, set realistic expectations, which sounds a little softer. But the more the years go by and the more that I see that's going on, I have no problem saying lower them. If they are insanely high, which they are, you have to lower them to get them to that realistic level. In one coaching session, I spoke with an unmarried 30-something woman whose friends tell her to drop any guy she dates who has the slightest annoying habit, because they said that over time his habits will become even more impossible to live with. This is an example of, the many young people's view of how to pick a spouse, right? Just don't look for somebody with an annoying habit. I mean, who the hell doesn't have an annoying habit? We all have them. I mean, if you can find someone who doesn't, that's phenomenal. That is so not significant in a long marriage, relatively speaking. The bottom line is that if you harbor a notion that you should never settle for less than the best, which is what women in particular are told, you are doomed to fail in your love life. No one human being can fulfill all of your sexual desires, plus make a great husband and father who does childcare and housework, by the way, alongside you, quote unquote 50-50. We're going to get to that in a minute. Plus fulfills all of your emotional needs. Like this Hollywood version that you imagine. You have to decide what's most important to you and move it to the top of the list. And stop expecting marriage to provide something it can't. Marriage at its core is about children. Let's face it. Even the younger generation who are avoiding or postponing marriage in droves know this, because the ones that do get married, it's almost always because they want to have a family. So they take it up to the last possible moment. And then, I got to have children, so I want to legitimize those children, so we got to get married in order to do this. I mean, I think that's, people don't say that in that way, but that's really what's happening. Now, which isn't to say that people aren't having children without getting married. Of course, there is that. But for those who are, it's usually, the biological clock that's propelling them along, and knowing that children need marriage. So, yeah. And it's not men who have these high expectations typically for marriage, because they have fewer wants and needs than women do, and because they're not as affected by what everyone else has on social media. They're not, I don't mean men never compare, but just generally speaking, social media is a female space. Men are typically over on YouTube learning and getting, either learning something, trying to learn something, or get support for their beliefs, but they're not there to compare what their lives to what other people have. That's really a space for social media with all those visual images, and women are largely doing that. So that's dramatically affecting their expectations. How could it not? I mean, generally, what men want is very simple. Just a nice girl who's very pretty, who treats them well, and who likes sex. That's pretty much the sum of it. If you were to ask a guy, you're not going to get a litany of 2 pages of all these needs that they want met. But women will. They'll have a whole list. And this is more true today than it's ever been. It used to be enough to find a stable, attractive, good man to marry. Now he has to be a Hollywood type to gain any attention. And then once the men do marry, the expectation is that they be these huge providers as well as a hands-on parent, since that's what most women are now doing. And that's become a shit show because you can't have it both ways. If you want to live a certain lifestyle, your man isn't going to be available at home the way you'd like him to be, because it takes the majority of one's waking hours to make that kind of money. You have to choose what you want for your life and accept the trade-offs. And I am just more and more convinced that these inflated and ridiculously high expectations are what's causing so many problems, both with single people getting together, and then once they have gotten together, with staying together. We just don't depict a realistic view of not only what marriage is, but what is reasonable to expect from it. And so it's just these images. It's just Hollywood. It's just insane. It's ridiculous. You have to lower them. That's number 2. Lower your expectations. Accept the trade-offs for whatever you've chosen to put at the top. Number 3, dump the concept of equality. Countless modern couples have had their marriages fall apart due to the lie that they've been fed that a good marriage is a union of equals. Not equals as in a partnership, as this program is always saying, equal in value but wildly different by nature. Equals as in interchangeable, as though husbands and wives can and should perform the exact same tasks with equal fervor and with identical results. Never going to happen. In fact, the most successful marriages are quite the opposite. Each partner focuses primarily on one task, or they divvy them up according to whatever they've decided, according to whatever they prefer to do, according to whatever they think is, relatively fair, however it came to be. And this does not mean there's never any overlap. It just means that they're super clear about who's responsible for what, so there isn't constant conversation and negotiation going on. And that is unquestionably a factor in marriages today that have so much conflict. There's just constant negotiation going on. For instance, in my marriage, I almost always make our bed, but I've never mowed our lawn. I almost always cook dinner, but I rarely clean up. We do both do laundry, so there's overlap there. What else? I never go to the hardware store for anything. I don't pay the bills. I used to, first half of our marriage, or maybe a little longer. Gave that up some years ago. It's been fabulous. When our children were home, Bill was never responsible for anything school related. I took care of all school matters and informed him accordingly. And when he needed to show up, he'd show up, or when he needed to know something. But I took care of all of that. He and I have had plenty of conflict in our marriage, just like any couple, but rarely, if ever, did it involve playing tit for tat or complaining about our respective roles and responsibilities. And this is in part because he's always been the primary breadwinner, while I've been able to do the creative thing. which meant that in turn, I accepted and took on more of the home stuff without complaining because that was the trade-off we made. I mean, yours might look different, but the point is not to mirror ours, but to decide what works for you and then stick with it and literally have no conversation about it as much as possible. It really is doable. But I would say that most couples today are in constant competition with each other about these roles and responsibilities, largely because they're both working full time, which gives the illusion that they're interchangeable beings who are both going to be motivated by the same interests and desires regarding work and family tasks. But that's just not the reality. Most husbands are not going to care as much about things being just so on the home front. And they're also not typically good at doing several things at once, which basically when you're managing a home, you need to do several things at once. So it's just not the same. They also don't pick up on things the way women do. So that while we've proven that women can perform the stereotypical male role outside the home by working, I don't think the reverse will ever be true. I don't think most men will ever be as proficient, the average guy, most men, on the home front as women are, because that's not how they're made. And this is often where the frustration and conflict comes from. So those who have made the choice to both work full-time and year-round are going to have an uphill battle. There's just no way around it. It's going to be a separate kind of acceptance. And partly what I believe is part and parcel of that choice to live that way is to accept that things are never going to feel fair. They're just not. Because men and women aren't the same. So you're doing the same tasks by choice, but he is not going to do things the same way that you are at home. So, and I don't think he ever will. So that's a trade-off. That might be your trade-off, that you accept that you're going to take things on more. Or you can do what you hear women in the media do constantly, which is try to force men to be more like women. And we know where that gets us. So talk about a life of conflict. I mean, look, if you choose to have that life, this is going to be the trade-off. I don't know how else to say it. Or you can spend your life trying to force a round peg into a square hole. Or other way around. A square peg into a round hole? Okay, you know what I mean. Okay, number 4. This is a big one that's sort of recent for my husband and me because I've heard about it. I'd heard about it for years, but I just never employed it or looked into it. And that is to learn each other's love language. This is that book by Gary Chapman called The 5 Love Languages. I'm sure many of you know exactly what I'm talking about. So the 5 love languages are words of affirmation, gifts, quality time, acts of service, and physical touch. It can be a game changer to learn your spouse's and your own love language. And then the other partner just speaks to your language. I think this was really quite brilliant. I can vouch for it personally. I mean, for example, my husband Bill is big on words of affirmation. I might have mentioned this before. I could care less. Could care less. Like I shouldn't say I could care less. I certainly like to hear "I love you," and I like to hear positive things, but I don't. It just doesn't land for me. Pumping me up or supporting me, that kind of stuff is just it just doesn't work for me. Same with gifts. I'd say those 2 are the biggest things that just are kind of meaningless for me. I'm a huge quality time girl. And probably all 3 of those other things. Quality time, acts of service, physical touch. Quality time is the biggest. Acts of service, Bill is awesome at. He'll do these really teeny things for me, like notice that I need something and get it. And I just think I've died and gone to heaven. That's just the greatest thing ever. Whereas if he were to give me, a $10,000 necklace, I'd be like, how much did that cost? Like, okay. It's just not my thing. Excuse me. And there's no right or wrong to any of this. It's just whatever works for you. So my learning that he feeds off of the words of affirmation and the physical touch, although we're both kind of touchy, naturally, I mean, and that his learning that quality time is my thing has really been a game changer. He has gone out of his way to put everything down, look me in the eye, really give me that attention that I crave. And it's been a game changer. And what we tend to do is what works for us, right? So he's not as much of a quality time. He's more the words of affirmation. So here I am, like looking for quality time and not doing the other thing. And so that's not working for him. And he was doing the reverse because we do what comes naturally to us. But you actually have to learn what your spouse's language is and then just do that all the time, even if it doesn't work for you at all. That's the trick. And it's pretty overnight. It's super cool. So that's number 4, learn each other's love language. Number 5, keep dating. Keep dating. I know so many couples, especially long married couples, struggle to keep the spark alive. I don't think there's anybody who isn't going to struggle with that because that's just life. And I talked about this in episode 174. If you all missed that, I did a whole thing on the sexual lives of husbands and wives on episode 174 because they don't embrace how different men and women really are in this department. You know, there's a real disconnect, I think, because men can just sort of, they don't need as much for that, you know, for the sex part that women do. But women need romance, pure and simple. They eat it up. They eat it up. And the more you keep dating, the way you did when you first met, the more that spark will reignite. I totally believe that. The only reason it wouldn't is if years have gone by where there's been no sex for a long, long time and there's all this resentment, which we're going to get into number 6. And then it would be hard to reignite. But assuming you haven't gotten to that point, you know, people ask me how to do this. But we all, how to date, right? How do you keep dating? We all know what worked in the beginning. It wasn't rocket science. Just do what you did at the beginning that came naturally as much as you can. And you'll feel it again. The problem is life gets in the way. So I don't want to spend too much time on it because as I said, I did this in episode 174, but just, you have to keep dating. I'm a big believer in this. Bill and I did not always do it. I understand that life gets in the way, but I also know for a fact that if you commit to it once a week, start with it once every other week. And of course, this will depend on your stage of life. If you have babies at home, this is not going to be necessarily doable. Maybe it's only once a month. You know, you just kind of have to figure that out. But to regularly be connecting in a way that does not involve your children is just huge. And the most successful couples do this. They will have a commitment to this. Some sort of something that where children aren't allowed and it's just the two of you again. It can work wonders. And as far as what you're doing with that time, you know, it doesn't have to always be the traditional going out for dinner, you know, getting dressed up or, you know, whatever you might think of as a traditional date, but it should involve the kinds of things that you employed early on. I mean, what did you use? You probably, you know, you cleared away some time. It probably included paying really close attention to how you looked. It might have or probably included music. I don't know. You have to be creative. It really doesn't matter how you do it as long as you do it. And you do it and you make a commitment to doing it. So that's number 5. Keep dating. Finally, number 6. Don't let resentment settle in. Resentment is almost always the culprit for a marriage going south. There are 1,000 reasons why resentment can build, but the underlying way in which it builds is almost always the same, and that's avoidance. Or maybe you aren't avoiding it, but you're not getting anywhere. You're not making headway. But avoidance is the biggest. By not addressing whatever it is that's bothering you, or that hurt you, or that's not okay with you, or that you don't understand, whatever it is, the resentment process begins right there. The moment you don't address it and you swallow it. And the longer you let it go on, the harder it will be to rectify. This is super hard. I know that, because there's going to be things that aren't always solvable. Excuse me. So you might have to agree to disagree and then be good with that. Otherwise, you're saying that you're okay when you're really not. And then over time, this builds until one day you have a fight. And it's not about the issue at all that you think you're talking about, but about months or even years of this built up resentment. And I think this is really the most difficult thing, because if you can remove resentment from your brain for a moment, whatever you might feel resentful for or about, and just remove it entirely, go back in your brain to before that ever happened, and you get this sort of immediate warmth toward your spouse. And you can, if you really look back, this is especially true if you've been married a long time, and you start to see the things that have happened, you can feel it, right? The resentment, sort of, you can almost feel it. It's like a physical thing. And then the way you look at the person is different. And if you magically remove that resentment, or think about back before, like I said, you ever had it to begin with, you immediately feel warmer. So you can see how much resentment is the culprit. It's all about not letting it settle in for the long haul. I don't think there's a marriage that isn't going to deal with some sort of resentment. That just doesn't feel realistic to me. But being aware of it and knowing when you're feeling it and then hashing it out until it's resolved and gone is the key. And people who are able to do that have a significantly stronger relationship. I mean, that's just kind of common sense. You don't need statistics to prove that. We've all experienced it and felt it. And so there's times when you're softer and there's times when you're harder toward your spouse. And it's almost always resentment that's causing the hardness. So I phrased that very specifically. Don't let resentment settle in. I didn't say don't be resentful, because that's silly. You're human. But don't let it settle in. Recognize it and get to it right away. And if it doesn't work the first time, you come back again. Doesn't work then, you come back again. If it doesn't work then, you come back again. You come back every day or every week until it's resolved. That's what I mean by don't let it settle in. Okay, so that's it. 6 damn good ways to divorce-proof your marriage. Number 1, take divorce off the table. Number 2, lower your expectations. Number 3, dump the concept of equality. Number 4, learn each other's love language. Number 5, keep dating. And number 6, don't let resentment settle in. These are super powerful ways, I believe, to divorce-proof your marriage. And that ends this hour of the Suzanne Venker Show. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast and to leave us a review, as well as share this episode with a friend. As always, you may reach me with any questions or comments at Suzanne@thesuzannevenkershow.com. And if you would like to support this podcast, which would be very much appreciated, you can do so at patreon.com/The Suzanne Venker Show. Thanks, everyone. Have a good week.